Emily stood at the bus stop, her shoulders aching from a long day at work. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the bustling city streets. The air was cool, and she pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as the bus approached. It screeched to a halt, its doors hissing open, and a crowd of tired commuters shuffled inside. She squeezed through the narrow aisle, managing to find an empty seat near the middle. Grateful for the chance to sit, she exhaled and leaned her head against the window. As the bus rumbled forward, Emily pulled out her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through pictures of her nieces. The hum of conversations around her blended into the background. At the next stop, the bus jolted as more passengers boarded. Emily looked up and noticed an elderly man struggling to steady himself as he stepped inside. He was wearing a faded military jacket, its patches and medals barely holding on to the worn fabric. A cane trembled in his hand as he gripped the pole near the front. His face was lined with age, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes. Emily glanced around, hoping someone closer would offer him their seat. But most passengers avoided eye contact, their heads buried in their phones or newspapers. Her heart sank. She hesitated for a moment, then stood up and called out, "Sir, you can take my seat." The man looked surprised and gave her a small, appreciative nod. "Thank you, miss," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. Slowly, he made his way to her seat, leaning heavily on his cane. Emily smiled and steadied him as he sat down. "It's no problem. You looked like you needed it more than me," she said softly. The man chuckled, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "It's not every day someone shows kindness like that. Thank you again." Emily remained standing, holding on to a pole for balance as the bus rolled forward. She couldn't help but glance at the man every now and then. Something about him intrigued her. Maybe it was the medals on his jacket or the quiet dignity he carried despite his frailty. "Were you in the military?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. The man looked up, his expression softening. "A long time ago," he said, his gaze distant as if remembering something far away. "Name's Harper. Served in the army during the war." Emily nodded, suddenly feeling a pang of respect for this stranger. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Harper." He gave her a slight smile. "You're kind to say that." The bus continued on, bouncing over potholes and stopping to let passengers on and off. As the ride went on, Emily noticed how little Mr. Harper carried with him: a small, worn duffel bag and his cane. His jacket, though tattered, was clean and neatly pressed. There was an air of pride about him, despite his humble appearance. When the bus reached his stop, Mr. Harper stood with some difficulty. Emily instinctively moved to help him steady himself, but he waved her off gently. "Thank you again, young lady. You've done more than enough." As he shuffled toward the door, Emily saw something small fall from his duffel bag. She reached down and picked it up. A tarnished medal, its inscription barely legible. By the time she looked up to call out to him, he was gone, disappearing into the night. Emily stared at the medal in her hand, a strange feeling settling over her. She didn't know it yet, but this simple act of kindness was about to lead her on a journey that would change her life forever. Emily stood at her apartment door, staring at the medal she had picked up on the bus. The medal was cold in her hand, and its surface was tarnished, but she could still make out the faint letters engraved on it. It read, "For valor and sacrifice." The words sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just an ordinary medal. It represented something significant, something she didn't fully understand yet. The memory of the elderly man, Mr. Harper, lingered in her mind. His warm smile and humble demeanor had struck a chord with her. Who was he really? And why had he been carrying such an important medal in a simple duffel bag? These questions swirled in her thoughts as she sat down at her small kitchen table. She turned the medal over in her hands, wondering what to do. She didn't know where Mr. Harper lived, and asking around might be a long shot, but something inside her urged her not to give up. He deserved to have this back. The next morning, Emily decided to retrace her steps. She boarded the same bus, hoping to see Mr. Harper again. As the vehicle rumbled through the familiar route, her eyes scanned each stop, searching for the veteran. Passengers came and went, but there was no sign of him. By the time the bus reached the last stop, Emily's heart sank. She stepped off, holding the medal tightly in her hand. The street was quiet, lined with modest houses and a small park. It seemed like the kind of neighborhood where Mr. Harper might live. She approached a woman walking her dog and asked, "Excuse me, have you seen an older gentleman wearing a military jacket? His name is Mr. Harper." The woman paused, thinking. "Mr. Harper? Oh, you might mean the man who lives a few blocks down. He's a sweet old guy. Always says hello when I walk by. His house is the blue one with the white fence." Emily's heart leaped with hope. "Thank you so much," she said, hurrying in the direction the woman had pointed. When she reached the house, she hesitated. The white fence was slightly chipped, and the yard was neatly maintained, though the house itself looked a little worn. Emily took a deep breath and knocked on the door. After a moment, the door creaked open. Mr. Harper stood there, leaning on his cane. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw her. "Well, if it isn't the kind young lady from the bus," he said, smiling warmly. "What brings you here?" Emily held out the medal. "You dropped this yesterday. I wanted to make sure it got back to you." Mr. Harper's expression changed. He took the medal from her with trembling hands, his eyes glistening. "I thought I'd lost this for good," he said softly. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means to me." Emily felt a wave of emotion. It seemed important. I couldn't just leave it. He invited her in, and as they sat down, Mr. Harper began to share the story behind the medal. His voice carried both pride and sorrow as he recounted his time in the war, the friends he had lost, and the sacrifices he had made. Emily listened intently, her respect for him growing with every word. Before she left, Mr. Harper clasped her hand. "You didn't have to go out of your way for me, but you did. That kind of kindness is rare. Thank you." As Emily walked away, she felt a deep sense of purpose. She didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of a journey that would uncover a story far bigger than she had imagined. The next morning, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Harper and the story he had shared. She replayed his words in her mind. Stories of courage, loss, and selflessness. Yet something about the way he spoke lingered with her. His tone was heavy, as if there were parts of his story he hadn't shared. The medal, now returned to its rightful owner, felt like a puzzle piece in a larger picture she couldn't yet see. Sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop, Emily decided to learn more about the medal. She typed its inscription into the search bar. For valor and sacrifice. Pages of results popped up, many about military awards given to soldiers for extraordinary acts of bravery. One article caught her eye. It described how this specific medal was awarded during a major conflict decades ago, honoring those who had gone above and beyond to save lives. As she scrolled through the article, she saw names of decorated soldiers, but none of them were Harper. Emily frowned. How could someone like him, so brave and selfless, not be mentioned? She widened her search, typing Harper and the war's name together. Her screen loaded slowly, and her heart raced in anticipation. The results revealed a few scattered pieces of information. A soldier named James Harper had indeed served in the same war, but there were no detailed records about him. One mention stood out, a news clipping from an old newspaper. It described a heroic act where a soldier saved several comrades during a dangerous mission, but the name of the soldier had been redacted for privacy. Emily's curiosity deepened. Could Mr. Harper be that unnamed hero? Determined to find out more, she decided to visit the local library. The library was quiet, with rows of towering shelves filled with books and archives. Emily approached the librarian, an elderly woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose. "Excuse me," Emily said. "I'm looking for information about a local veteran named James Harper. I believe he served in the war." The librarian nodded thoughtfully. "We have a section of old newspapers and military records. You might find something there." Emily thanked her and headed to the archives. Hours passed as she sifted through yellowed pages and dusty files. Finally, she found a small article that caught her eye. It was dated decades ago and described a soldier's bravery during a perilous mission. The soldier had risked his life to rescue his team, even after being injured. The details matched the story Mr. Harper had shared, but his name was absent. Frustrated but determined, Emily took a photo of the article with her phone. She left the library with a mix of excitement and unease. If Mr. Harper was this hero, why wasn't he recognized? What had happened that led to his name being forgotten? That night, as Emily lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She felt a strong pull to uncover the truth, not just for her own curiosity, but because she believed Mr. Harper deserved to be acknowledged. Little did she know, her quest would lead her to uncover secrets far more profound than she ever imagined. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Harper's story deserved more recognition. She felt a responsibility to uncover the truth, not only for him, but for the community that seemed unaware of the quiet hero living among them. With the photo of the newspaper article saved on her phone, Emily decided to dig deeper. The next morning, she called her friend Lisa, who worked as a reporter for the local paper. Lisa was always curious about a good story and had access to resources Emily couldn't reach on her own. "Lisa, I need your help with something," Emily began, explaining the details about Mr. Harper, the medal, and her visit to the library. Lisa listened carefully. "That's fascinating, Emily. I'll see what I can find about him in our archives. If he's a forgotten hero, this could be a powerful story." Encouraged by Lisa's interest, Emily decided to visit the local Veterans Association. It was a modest building with flags fluttering outside and plaques lining the walls inside, honoring soldiers from the area. A man in his 60s, with a kind smile and a firm handshake, greeted her at the reception desk. "How can I help you today?" he asked. "I'm looking for information about a veteran named James Harper," Emily said. "He served in the war, and I believe he might have been involved in a significant rescue mission." The man's brow furrowed. "Harper, that name rings a bell. Wait here a moment." He disappeared into the back office, returning with a dusty file. "We don't have much on him, but this might help," he said, handing Emily the file. Emily opened it carefully, her heart pounding. Inside were a few faded photographs, one of a young man in uniform, Mr. Harper, unmistakably. There was also a handwritten letter from one of his comrades, describing how Harper had saved their lives during a harrowing mission. The letter spoke of Harper's bravery, but also hinted at a falling out with higher-ups in the military, possibly explaining why his name was omitted from official records. "Why would they leave his name out?" Emily asked, confused. The man shrugged. "It's hard to say. Sometimes politics and personal disagreements overshadow what's right. Harper was a good man. I'm glad someone's taking an interest in his story." Emily thanked him and left, her mind racing with questions. She met Lisa later that evening, sharing what she had found. Lisa had also uncovered new information, a government file that seemed to confirm Harper's involvement in the rescue mission. However, it was heavily redacted, with many details blacked out. "This doesn't make sense," Lisa said, frowning. "Why go to such lengths to hide his role?" Emily's determination only grew. "We need to talk to people who served with him. Maybe they can fill in the gaps." Lisa agreed to help track down other veterans who might have known Harper. Meanwhile, Emily decided she would visit Mr. Harper again. She wanted to hear his story directly, even if he was reluctant to share. The next day, Emily stood at Mr. Harper's door, clutching the file and the newspaper article. She knocked, her heart pounding. When the door opened, Harper looked surprised to see her. "You're back," he said, his voice warm but curious. "What brings you here again?" Emily took a deep breath. "I think your story deserves to be told, Mr. Harper, and I'd like your help in telling it." Mr. Harper stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet sigh, he stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. Emily stepped into Mr. Harper's modest home. The small living room was simple but neat, with a worn couch, a small table, and shelves lined with books and a few framed photographs. A faint scent of coffee lingered in the air. Mr. Harper gestured for her to sit, and she took a seat on the couch while he eased himself into a chair opposite her, leaning slightly on his cane. "So," he said with a small smile, "you seem determined. What have you found?" Emily pulled the newspaper article and file from her bag, placing them on the table between them. "Mr. Harper, I've been learning about your medal and the rescue mission you were part of. I also spoke to someone at the Veterans Association. They said you saved lives during the war, but your name isn't mentioned in the records. Why?" Harper's smile faded. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "You've done your homework," he said softly. "I suppose you deserve an answer." There was a long pause as he seemed to gather his thoughts. "That mission," he began, "was one of the hardest days of my life. We were deep in enemy territory, and everything went wrong. Our unit was ambushed, and most of the men were injured or pinned down. I don't know how I found the strength, but I managed to carry 3 of them out, one by one, under heavy fire." Emily leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "That's incredible," she said. "You're a hero, Mr. Harper." He shook his head. "Heroes get medals and recognition. I got silence." His voice was tinged with bitterness. "After the war, there were disagreements with my commanding officer. I spoke up about some things I shouldn't have, things I thought were wrong. Let's just say it didn't win me any favors." Emily frowned. "So they left your name out because of politics?" Harper nodded slowly. "It happens more often than you'd think. They couldn't deny the mission's success, but they could erase me from it." Emily felt a wave of anger on his behalf. "That's not fair. You did something extraordinary, and people should know." Harper gave her a small, sad smile. "Fairness doesn't always matter in the world, Emily. I learned it the hard way." But Emily wasn't ready to accept that. "Mr. Harper, this isn't just about fairness. It's about honoring what you did. The men you saved, they owe their lives to you. Their families owed you. People like me, who've never been to war, need to know that courage like yours exists." Harper studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but it's been decades. I've made peace with it." Emily shook her head. "But I haven't. If you won't fight for your story, then I will." Harper's lips twitched in what might have been the hint of a smile. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" "Maybe," Emily admitted, smiling back. "But I think someone has to be." For the first time, Harper chuckled. "All right," he said. "If you're that determined, I'll tell you everything. But be warned, there's more to the story than what you've found so far." As Emily listened, pen and notebook ready, she knew this was just the beginning of uncovering the full truth about Mr. Harper's incredible past. Emily sat quietly as Mr. Harper began to speak, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. The faint hum of a clock on the wall was the only other sound in the room. Harper's gaze was distant, as if he were reliving the moments he described. "It wasn't just about carrying men out of danger," he said. "The mission we were on was doomed from the start. We were sent into a region we weren't prepared for. Poor intelligence, bad weather, and faulty equipment. We were outnumbered and outgunned." Emily nodded, scribbling notes in her notebook. "But you didn't give up." Harper smiled faintly. "Giving up wasn't an option. We had orders to hold our position, but when the ambush happened, I knew we had to act fast. Our radio was down, so there was no calling for help. It was chaos. Smoke, gunfire, men shouting." His voice faltered for a moment, and Emily noticed his hand tighten around the arm of his chair. "One of the men was hit badly, Peterson. He was just a kid, barely out of training. I carried him first, dodging bullets and running as fast as I could. By the time I got back for the others, my legs were shaking, but I didn't stop. Emily's pen paused mid-sentence. What gave you this strength? Harper looked at her, his expression earnest. It wasn't strength, Emily. It was duty. Those men were my brothers. We all signed up knowing the risks, but when you're out there, it's not about orders or medals. It's about the person next to you. She nodded, her chest tightening. What happened after you got everyone out? Harper's gaze dropped to the floor. We lost 2 men that day. I couldn't save them all. But the ones I did, they made it home. That was what mattered. The room fell silent for a moment before Harper continued. When we got back to base, the higher-ups called it a victory. They pinned medals on a few of us, took pictures, and sent out a press release. But the real story wasn't so clean. They didn't want to admit the mission was poorly planned, or that we barely survived. Emily felt anger bubbling inside her. So they covered it up. Something like that, Harper said. I wrote a letter to my superiors, pointing out the flaws in the operation. I wasn't trying to stir trouble, just make sure no one else went through what we did. But it didn't go over well. They decided it was easier to forget me than deal with what I said. Emily leaned forward. But why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you tell your story? Harper sighed. I tried at first, but no one wanted to listen. Over time, I realized the men I saved. That was enough for me. I didn't need recognition. But you deserve it, Emily insisted. People need to hear what you did, not just for the men you saved, but for everyone who's ever been ignored or forgotten. Harper studied her, his eyes softening. You remind me of someone I knew, a journalist who once believed in the power of truth. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time. Emily felt a surge of determination. It's not just time. It's overdue. Let's make sure the world knows your story. Harper smiled, and for the first time, Emily saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. She knew there was still more to uncover, but she was ready for whatever came next. With Mr. Harper's story now shared between them, Emily knew what needed to be done. It wasn't enough for just a few people to hear about his courage and sacrifices. The world needed to know. She had a plan, but she couldn't do it alone. The first person she turned to was Lisa, her friend and reporter. Lisa had been helping her gather information, but now it was time to go further. Emily called her up and explained how Mr. Harper had opened up about the truth of the mission and the sacrifices he had made. You're right, Lisa said, her voice excited. This is a story people need to hear. I can write an article, and maybe we can even organize an event to honor him. What do you think? I think we need to do more, Emily replied. Let's reach out to the community. We can organize a fundraiser and invite veterans, their families, and anyone who wants to show their respect. We need to give Mr. Harper the recognition he deserves. Lisa agreed, and the two of them got to work. They contacted the local newspaper, veterans associations, and even reached out on social media, telling the community about Mr. Harper's bravery and the mission that had never been properly acknowledged. The response was overwhelming. The story of Mr. Harper spread quickly. People from all over the area came forward, sharing their own stories of veterans who had been forgotten or overlooked. They wanted to help honor Mr. Harper's legacy. Soon, donations for the event started pouring in. Local businesses offered to sponsor the gathering, and a nearby hall was booked for the ceremony. Emily worked tirelessly, making sure every detail was taken care of. She even convinced a local musician to perform during the event, adding a special touch that would make the day unforgettable. As the event day drew closer, Mr. Harper seemed both nervous and touched by all the attention. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. Emily could see it in his eyes when they spoke, but he never backed down from the idea. The day of the event, the hall was filled with people, veterans, their families, and members of the community who had all gathered to show their appreciation for Mr. Harper's quiet bravery. Emily was there, standing at the back of the room, watching as people shared stories of their own experiences with veterans. But all eyes were on Mr. Harper, who sat at the front, a little out of place but with a proud look on his face. When the moment finally arrived, Emily stepped up to the microphone. She told the crowd about Mr. Harper's extraordinary heroism, his sacrifice, and the reason why it had been left unacknowledged for so long. She spoke of the time he had spent saving the lives of his comrades, risking everything to get them out of harm's way. As Emily finished, the crowd rose to their feet, applauding. Mr. Harper's eyes glistened, his face a mix of gratitude and disbelief. He stood slowly and made his way to the front, where Emily handed him the medal he had lost months ago. "Today," she said, "we honor you not just for your actions, but for your strength, your humility, and your willingness to keep going, even when the world turned its back on you." Harper looked at the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all, from the bottom of my heart. I never expected anything like this, but it means more than words can say." The event was a success, and for the first time in decades, Mr. Harper received the recognition he had always deserved. But more than that, he saw the power of a community coming together to honor the unsung heroes who had given so much. As the night ended, Emily felt a sense of fulfillment. She knew that this was just the beginning of many untold stories waiting to be shared. The success of the event spread beyond the community. Stories about Mr. Harper's bravery and the recognition he finally received appeared in local news outlets, and soon, people from other towns reached out to share their own experiences with forgotten veterans. Mr. Harper's story had sparked something deeper, something bigger than anyone had imagined. Emily visited Mr. Harper the day after the ceremony. The day was bright, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. As she walked up to his door, she noticed that he was sitting on the small porch, his cane resting beside him. He looked peaceful, like the weight of the past had finally been lifted. "Good morning, Mr. Harper," Emily greeted, stepping up the stairs. He smiled at her, his eyes warm, yet still full of the quiet strength she had seen in him from the first moment they met. "Morning, Emily. I've been sitting here, thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I bet you've had a lot to think about," Emily replied, taking the seat beside him. "It's been a pretty eventful few days." Harper chuckled softly. "It has. I never imagined so many people would care. But you've done something I never thought was possible. You brought me back to life in a way. Emily, my story's been buried for so long. And now it's out there." Emily smiled, feeling the sense of pride, but she could see that there was more on his mind. "What else are you thinking about?" she asked gently. Harper took a deep breath, his eyes focused on the peaceful surroundings. "You know, I've had my share of regrets, especially after the war. It wasn't just about the mission. It was everything that followed. The distance between me and the world, the anger at the way I was treated. I never felt like I had a place. But now, looking at this, at the way people are looking at me differently, it's like I can finally breathe again." Emily listened closely, feeling the depth of his words. She knew the journey wasn't just about recognition for him, but healing from years of silence. "There's one more thing," Harper continued, his voice softer now. "You've been so kind to me, Emily, more than anyone has in a long time. And for a while, I've been thinking about something I didn't tell you. There's a reason I never spoke about the past much, and it's not just about the war." Emily turned to him, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" He paused for a moment, his hands clasped in his lap. "I lost something I never got back. A family. A daughter. I haven't spoken to her in years, not since she was little. I didn't want her to grow up in the shadow of my past, so I stayed away. I've always wondered what would have happened if I'd been a better father, but I never reached out. I never knew how." Emily's heart sank. "Your daughter? Do you know where she is now?" Harper nodded slowly. "I have a contact from long ago, a letter that was never sent. I think I might try to reach out to her, but I've waited so long, I don't know if she'll want anything to do with me." Emily placed a hand on his. "You don't know unless you try." He looked at her, his face softening. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time. As they sat there together, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for Mr. Harper. He had faced so much in his life, his service, his regrets, his sacrifices. And now, with his story finally told, it seemed like a new chapter was beginning. A chapter that might just lead him back to a family he thought he had lost forever. A week passed after Mr. Harper's revelation about his daughter. Emily couldn't stop thinking about it. She knew how much it had weighed on him. The years of regret and missed opportunities. He had given so much to others, but when it came to his own family, the silence was almost too much to bear. Emily decided to help him take that first step. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't stand the thought of Mr. Harper living with the what-ifs any longer. She spent hours researching online, looking up any possible connections to the name he had mentioned in his letter. It wasn't much, just a few clues he had from years ago. An address, a phone number, and a name. The following day, Emily drove to Mr. Harper's house. She had a plan. She found him sitting in his favorite spot on the porch, the same cane leaning against the railing. As she approached, he looked up and smiled. "Hey there, Emily. How's your day going?" he asked, his voice warm but tired. "I've been busy," Emily replied, sitting down next to him. "But I think I've found something." Mr. Harper's eyes widened. "Found what?" Emily hesitated for a moment. She had no idea what would come of this, but she needed him to know that he didn't have to go through this alone. "I found a way to contact your daughter," she said, holding out a piece of paper with a phone number and a name written on it. Harper's face softened. "You found her." His voice was barely a whisper. "I think so," Emily replied. "I found an address that matches. It's a long shot, but I believe this could be the first step. Would you want to call her?" For a moment, Harper didn't speak. His hands trembled slightly as he held the paper in his lap. His eyes were distant, as though he were processing a lifetime of emotions all at once. Emily could feel the weight of the moment. Maybe I've waited too long," Harper said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know if she'll want to talk to me. I haven't been there for so many years." Emily placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You won't know unless you try. And she might be just as curious about you as you are about her. You've always been a part of her life, even if it wasn't in the way you imagined." After a long pause, Harper nodded. "You're right. It's time." He picked up the phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed the number Emily had given him. The sound of the ringing echoed in the quiet afternoon air. Each second felt like an eternity. Emily sat quietly beside him, her heart racing with anticipation. Finally, the line clicked and a voice answered. "Hello." Harper's breath caught in his throat. Is this Clara Harper?" There was a long pause before the voice on the other end responded, softer now. "Yes, this is Clara. Who is this?" I'm your father," Harper said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know it's been a long time, but I've never stopped thinking about you." There was another pause, a silence that felt like it stretched forever. Then, Clara's voice came through the line, calm but with an edge of surprise. "Dad," she said. I don't know what to say." Harper closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed to hear your voice." Emily sat quietly, watching as the years of regret and longing melted away from Harper's face. For the first time, he seemed at peace. The phone call was the beginning of something new for him, a chance to reconnect with the daughter he had lost, a chance to heal. And as Emily watched, she knew that this was the moment Mr. Harper had been waiting for. It was the moment when he realized that, despite everything he had been through, it wasn't too late for him to make things right.